Section 1. The question that breaks the lore community. There is a question that has haunted the Warhammer 40,000 community since the very first rulebooks hit shelves in the late 1980s. A question that has started more arguments than any edition change, any army release, any controversial model redesign. A question that lives in the dark corners of every fan forum, every Discord server, every late-night conversation between two people who have spent far too much of their lives reading about grimdark space demigods. Can any Primarch actually defeat the Emperor of Mankind? Not inconvenience him, not wound him, not slow him down for a moment before being obliterated. Actually, genuinely, definitively beat the most powerful human psychic entity that has ever existed in the lore of Warhammer 40,000. Now, before we even begin, we need to set some ground rules, because this question is far messier than it first appears. The Emperor is not a simple character. He is not a straightforward unit with a stat line and a defined power ceiling. He is a being who has been described across decades of lore, hundreds of novels, dozens of codex entries, and countless conflicting sources, each one adding new layers of complexity and, occasionally, flat-out contradiction. The Emperor you read about in the very earliest realm of Chaos publications is different in subtle ways from the Emperor you encounter in the Siege of Terra novel series. The Emperor who walked the galaxy during the Great Crusade, vibrant and present and terrifying in his full operational power, is a very different creature from the near-dead psychic lighthouse, currently slumped on the Golden Throne on Terra. So, when we ask whether a Primarch could beat him, we have to ask, which version? Under what circumstances? With what preparation? In the materium, physical reality, or in the warp? In peak condition, or after years of being drained by the Golden Throne's mechanisms? These distinctions matter enormously, and we are going to work through all of them. What we are going to do in this video is something a little different from the usual power ranking tier lists you might find elsewhere. We are not going to just line up the Primarchs from weakest to strongest and ask who gets closest to the Emperor's level. Instead, we are going to examine each serious candidate individually, look at their specific strengths and abilities, consider the exact circumstances under which they might have a genuine chance, and then build toward a real, considered answer to this question. Because there is an answer. It is not a satisfying, clean yes or no answer. This is Warhammer 40,000. Nothing is ever clean. But there is a most honest answer available, and we are going to find it. The candidates we will examine are Horus Lupercal, Magnus the Red, Vulcan, Angron, Lion L. Johnson, and Leman Russ. Each one has a genuine case to be made. Each one has been argued for passionately by sections of the fanbase. And each one has very real limitations that complicate the question. By the end of this, you will have a much clearer picture of exactly how terrifyingly powerful the Emperor actually is, exactly how close some of his sons came to matching or surpassing him, and which one, under the very specific right set of circumstances, represents the most credible threat to the Master of Mankind. Let us begin. And before we go further, if this kind of deep lore exploration is something you enjoy, drop a comment below telling me which Primarch you think has the best shot. I genuinely want to know where you all stand on this. And if you want more videos like this one, hit subscribe so you never miss one. It takes 2 seconds and it means the world. Now, let us get into it. Section 2. The Emperor of Mankind. Understanding the ceiling. Before we can discuss who might beat the Emperor, we need to understand what exactly we are dealing with. And I mean really understand it. Not just, he is very powerful and lives on a chair. Understand it. But a genuine deep appreciation of the layered and almost incomprehensible nature of his abilities, his history, and his current state. The Emperor of Mankind is approximately 48,000 years old. Let that settle in for a moment. He was born, according to the most widely accepted version of his origin, sometime around 8,000 years before the Common Era, in what is now Anatolia in modern-day Turkey, during the Neolithic period of human history. He is a perpetual, one of a rare breed of immortal humans who cannot truly die, who regenerates from any wound and returns from death. This means he has been walking through human history, watching it unfold, guiding it in subtle ways, for longer than most ancient civilizations have existed. Think about what that means in terms of accumulated knowledge and experience alone. Every general who has ever lived, every philosopher, every scientist, every psyker. The Emperor has observed them all and outlived them all. He has had 48,000 years to master every discipline of warfare, statecraft, psychic science, biology, and metaphysics that humanity has ever developed. He is not merely powerful. He is the distilled product of tens of thousands of years of deliberate self-improvement in every conceivable field. But raw age and experience, as staggering as they are only the beginning of the Emperor's power. The Emperor is the most powerful human psychic entity that has ever existed in the galaxy. This is not a hyperbolic claim. It is stated consistently across sources from the 40K lore, from codex entries to Black Library novels to Forge World publications. His psychic abilities operate on a scale that most other psychers cannot even comprehend, let alone match. While a skilled librarian might be able to project force blasts, read minds, or glimpse fragments of the future, the Emperor can do things that bend the fundamental rules of reality. He created the Primarchs. Consider what that actually entails. The 20 Primarchs were not simply engineered in a laboratory the way a particularly ambitious scientist might modify a genome. They were psychic constructs of staggering complexity, each one woven from the Emperor's own genetic material and infused with psychic essence drawn from the warp itself. Magnus the Red, the most powerful psyker among the Primarchs, has been described by multiple sources as a lesser psyker than his father, and Magnus is capable of projecting his consciousness across an entire galaxy, communicating telepathically with beings on other worlds, and warping reality around himself through sheer psychic force. If Magnus is the lesser psyker, the mind struggles to frame what his father represents. The Emperor guided the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that allows human ships to navigate through the warp, from the Golden Throne, projecting a signal powerful enough to illuminate the entire galaxy for navigators who were tens of thousands of light years away. He held the breach in the Imperial Webway shut through sheer psychic willpower for years, preventing demonic hordes from flooding through into the heart of the Imperial Palace. He could soulbind psychers by touching them, essentially reaching into their minds and reinforcing their psychic defenses through pure mental power. In direct combat, the Emperor was essentially without peer in the galaxy among beings of physical form. His personal weapons, the Guardian Spear, the Burning of Laeran, the psychic sword he forged, were instruments of incredible destructive power, but they were secondary to his real threat. When the Emperor fought, his primary weapons were psychic. He could unleash blasts of concentrated warp energy powerful enough to vaporize targets, construct psychic shields capable of stopping almost anything, and reach into the warp itself to twist probability and reality around a battle. The question of exactly how powerful he is in direct combat is complicated by what happened with Horus, and we will examine that in extraordinary detail in the next section. But the key thing to understand for now is the floor, not the ceiling. The floor of the Emperor's combat power is demonstrated by what happened the moment he stopped holding back against Horus at the climax of the Siege of Terra. Now, the Emperor is not omnipotent. He is not a chaos god, and he does not operate on that level of existence. He has limits. He was wounded during battles before the Horus heresy. There is a famous incident involving an extraordinarily powerful orc war boss that nearly killed him, which was part of why Horus was elevated to War Master. He was not operating at full capacity during the Siege of Terra, having spent years chained to the Golden Throne, maintaining the psychic barriers around Terra and sustaining the Webway seal. He was drained, tired in the way that no human should ever be tired, fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously, and not all of them physical. And crucially, the Emperor has something that most gods and most conquerors have never truly had. He loves humanity. He genuinely, in his own cold and often terrible way, cares about the future of the human species. This is not a strategic calculation. It is a fundamental part of who he is. And that love, that capacity for care, is his greatest vulnerability. Because caring means hesitation. Caring means the possibility of holding back. Caring means that there might be a single, specific enemy against whom all that incomprehensible power falters. Not because the power is insufficient, but because the will to use it fully is compromised by something that no amount of psychic training can eliminate. This is the key to every serious candidate for defeating the Emperor. None of them can beat him through raw power alone. The math does not work. But several of them, under very specific circumstances, can exploit the gap between what the Emperor is capable of doing and what he is actually willing to do. That gap is where the real conversation lives. One more crucial element of the Emperor's power that we need to address before moving on: his perpetual nature. The Emperor, like Vulcan, like Olivier Soreca, like John Grammaticus, has the ability to regenerate from death given sufficient time. This makes truly killing him essentially impossible through conventional means. Even destroying his physical body would only be a temporary victory unless the soul itself was unmade, something only the most extraordinary forces in the galaxy can achieve. In the current lore of the 41st millennium, the Emperor sits on the Golden Throne in a state that might generously be called alive. His body is a withered, decaying husk, sustained by technology that no living person fully understands and by the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers whose life force is fed into the throne's mechanisms. His mind, however, remains active. He fights continuously in the warp against the forces of chaos. He guides the Astronomicon. He sends psychic impressions through the Emperor's tarot. He is not gone. He is simply diminished, operating at a fraction of the power he once possessed. And the question of what he is still capable of in this state is one of the genuinely unanswered mysteries of the setting. There is another dimension to the Emperor's power that rarely gets the discussion it deserves, and it is perhaps the most important one for our question. The Emperor is not merely powerful. He is wise in a way that almost no other being can claim, and wisdom, the accumulated understanding of consequences, of how things work across time, of where the crucial vulnerabilities in any system lie, is a form of power in its own right. The Emperor has watched empires rise and fall for 48,000 years. He has seen every kind of social structure, every kind of military organization, every kind of philosophical framework that humanity has ever developed, and he has personally participated in enough of them to understand their weaknesses from the inside. He knows how civilizations fail. He knows how leaders become monsters. He knows the ways that power corrupts and the specific mechanisms by which even good intentions can lead to catastrophic outcomes. He designed the Primarchs knowing exactly what they were. He did not create them blind. He understood what kind of being each one would become, what their deep natures would be, what their specific vulnerabilities were. He had planned, according to Malcador's hints in certain sources, to eventually use the Primarchs against each other in a final culling once the Great Crusade was complete, to ensure that humanity, not its superhuman instruments, would ultimately govern its own destiny. This planned culling was disrupted by chaos, but the fact that it was the plan tells us something crucial about the Emperor's strategic relationship with his sons. He had already thought about how to beat them. He had already worked out the specific approaches that would need to be used, the specific vulnerabilities that would need to be exploited. Whatever the final answer to our question is, the Emperor has already considered it in greater detail than any of us can. This does not mean the question is settled. It means the question is perhaps even more interesting than it first appears. Because if the Emperor planned to eventually deal with the Primarchs, and then chaos disrupted those plans and produced Horus and the heresy and the Golden Throne, then there is an argument that the Emperor's own preparations against his sons are now, 10,000 years later, incomplete. The plans he made for handling the Primarchs were designed for a specific window that has long since passed. The Primarchs who have survived and evolved, and in some cases ascended to demon prince status in the millennia since, are not the same beings the Emperor's plans accounted for. The Emperor has been on the throne for 10,000 years. He is not static. His consciousness continues to operate, continues to plan, continues to update. But planning is not the same as execution. And execution, against some of the specific threats we are about to examine, would require a body and a freedom of movement that the Emperor currently does not possess. Now, with all of that established, with the true magnitude of what we are dealing with properly in view, let us begin examining our candidates. Section 3. Horus Lupercal, the closest anyone has ever come. There is no honest conversation about which Primarch could beat the Emperor that does not begin with Horus. He is the answer that the lore itself gives us when we ask the question. He is the one who came closest. He is the one who, in a very real sense, actually did it. Horus Lupercal was the first Primarch recovered by the Emperor after the Chaos Gods scattered all 20 of them across the galaxy as infants. He was born on a feudal world called Chthoniya, a place of brutal gang warfare and survival of the fittest violence, and he rose through that environment with a speed and completeness that even other Primarchs found remarkable. When the Emperor found him, there was an immediate recognition, not just of parentage, but of kinship. Of all his sons, Horus was the one the Emperor spent the most time with in the early years, fighting alongside him, training with him, sharing something closer to an actual relationship than the Emperor seemed capable of forming with anyone else. This is the foundation of everything that follows. Horus was the favorite, not just in the sense that the Emperor promoted him above his brothers, though he did, making Horus the War Master of the entire Great Crusade, a position that placed him second only to the Emperor himself in authority over the entire Imperium's military, but in the deeper sense that the Emperor's emotional investment in Horus was real, in a way it was not with most of the other Primarchs. By the Emperor's own admission, as described through the Archon Land material, the Emperor viewed the Primarchs primarily as tools. He was not their father in any meaningful emotional sense. He allowed them to call him father because it was useful, because it inspired the kind of loyalty and devotion that made them better generals and warriors. But the connection was largely strategic, not parental. Horus was the exception. Horus was the one who got close enough to see the humanity that the Emperor kept hidden behind the facade of godhood. And Horus was the one who, when corrupted by chaos, became the single most dangerous thing the Emperor had ever created. The corruption of Horus is one of the most elaborated events in the entire Horus Heresy novel series. It began on a world called Davin, where Horus received a wound from a weapon touched by chaos and was taken to a temple to be healed. What happened in that temple remains somewhat mysterious, but the outcome is clear. When Horus emerged, he had been turned, not simply corrupted in the subtle way that some of his brothers were, seduced by promises, worn down by resentment, led slowly astray. Horus was transformed fundamentally, his soul opened to chaos in a way that made him a conduit for all four of the ruinous powers simultaneously. And then, as though this was not already extraordinary enough, he visited the Warp Gate on Molech. Molech is crucial to understanding why Horus was able to fight the Emperor at all. Beneath a world that the Emperor himself had visited during the Great Crusade, there was a Warp Gate, a direct conduit to a deep and ancient reservoir of power that the Emperor had drawn upon to ascend to something approaching godhood. When Horus found this gate and sacrificed millions of lives in a ritual to gain access to it, he did not merely receive the power of 4 chaos gods. He essentially reached into the same source of power the Emperor himself had used, drawing it through the lens of chaos rather than humanity's potential. This is why Horus could fight the Emperor blow for blow on the vengeful spirit. Not because he was simply a powerful Primarch who had gotten stronger, but because he had been elevated to a level that, for perhaps the only time in history, genuinely approached the Emperor's own. By the time of the Siege of Terra, Horus was already terrifying before you factored in the Molech power. He had led a decade-long galaxy-spanning war, outgeneraling some of the finest military minds in history, winning battles that should have been impossible, holding together an alliance of 9 traitor legions, 4 chaos powers, demonic hordes, and countless mortal forces through a combination of charisma, tactical genius, and the raw authority of his personality. He was the greatest general the galaxy had ever seen, and that military mastery extended directly into individual combat. Physically, Horus was among the very top tier of Primarchs. He was enormous even by their standards, towering and massively built, his strength amplified by his armor, the Terminator suit known as the Serpent Scales, later replaced with the corrupted Chaos Terminator armor that became part of him during the Heresy, to an almost incomprehensible degree. His weapons, most notably the Worldbreaker mace and his chaos-touched lightning claw, could tear through practically anything. He had the speed and reflexes of the greatest warrior in the galaxy, honed by decades of near-constant combat. Add to this the warp power flowing through him, not just the enhancement from 4 chaos gods, but the fundamental reality warping capability that came with being their chosen champion. And you have something that genuinely defies easy categorization. Horus was not just a Primarch who had gotten a power boost. He had been transformed into something new, something at the intersection of mortal and divine. On the vengeful spirit, he proved it. The Emperor arrived on Horus's flagship after Sanguinius had already fallen. The Blood Angel's Primarch, perhaps the most beloved of all the Emperor's sons, had gone ahead and faced Horus alone. The accounts of what happened vary across different sources, but the consistent element is this: Sanguinius died. The angel, whose courage and purity were legendary even among the Primarchs, faced Horus with everything he had, and was killed. Some accounts suggest that Sanguinius managed to crack Horus's armor, creating a weakness that the Emperor would later exploit. Others frame it more simply, as Horus using the power granted him by 4 gods to overwhelm one of the finest warriors in history. Either way, when the Emperor arrived, Horus was waiting, standing over the body of the angel. What followed was the most consequential fight in the history of the Warhammer 40,000 setting. The early accounts describe the Emperor holding back, hesitating to unleash his full power against a son he still hoped to reach. More recent sources, particularly the Siege of Terra novels, complicate this significantly. The Emperor's hesitation was real, but it was not simply a matter of fatherly love for a single son. It was a strategic and metaphysical calculation. The Emperor had foreseen multiple possible outcomes to this confrontation. He was not merely a warrior in a duel, he was a being who could perceive the probable futures branching from every action, and he was searching for the thread that led to the best outcome for humanity. The problem was that almost every thread he could see led to catastrophe. Horus, in the meantime, was not having any such hesitation. He burned the Emperor's face, he burst his eye, he ripped his arm from its socket, he broke the Emperor's spine over his knee, in a single act of physical dominance that should tell you everything you need to know about the gulf between Horus post-Moloch and the greatest warrior in the galaxy. For anyone keeping count, Horus essentially destroyed the Emperor physically. Multiple severe wounds, spine snapped. The Emperor was dying when the final moment came. What saved him, or rather, what allowed him to win while dying, was a single moment that has been interpreted in 100 different ways. A custodian guard, wandering through the transformed hellscape of the vengeful spirit, stumbled into the throne room. Horus looked at this man, this loyal soldier who had followed the Emperor through everything, and simply annihilated him, casually, without hesitation or mercy, just ended his existence as though he were nothing. And something in the Emperor broke open. Up until that moment, some part of the Emperor had still believed that Horus could be saved, still believed that somewhere inside the vessel of chaos that wore his son's face, the real Horus, the Horus who had laughed and fought beside him through the beginning of the Great Crusade, was still present, still reachable. The death of that nameless custodian showed him, with absolute clarity, that this was not true. The real Horus was gone. What remained was a puppet of the Chaos Gods wearing his face and using his memories as tools. The Emperor stopped holding back. What happened next was brief. A single concentrated psychic strike of such concentrated force that it did not merely destroy Horus's body, it obliterated his soul. Every trace of Horus Lupercal, the soul that the 4 Chaos Gods had invested an enormous portion of their power into strengthening and sustaining, was simply gone. Not stored in the warp for later resurrection, not scattered across the materium to be slowly reassembled. Gone, erased. The 4 most powerful entities in the warp could not bring him back. So, what does all of this tell us about whether Horus could have won? It tells us that under the specific conditions of their encounter, an emperor who was weakened after years on the Golden Throne, an emperor who was psychically and emotionally compromised by his unwillingness to immediately destroy his most beloved son, an emperor who had foreseen the encounter and chosen a specific path through it that involved accepting terrible wounds in order to find a narrow path to a survivable outcome. Horus came extraordinarily close to winning. He inflicted mortal wounds on the most powerful being in the galaxy. He had the physical dominance throughout most of the fight. He had the backing of 4 Chaos Gods and the power drawn from Molech. He had killed the only other Primarch who was present. And yet, the moment the Emperor committed, the moment he stopped calculating and stopped hoping and simply acted, it was over. 1 strike, that was all it took. The gap between what Horus could withstand and what the Emperor could produce when fully unleashed was still vast enough that even a severely wounded, physically broken Emperor could erase Horus in a single concentrated act. The lesson of Horus is not that a Primarch cannot beat the Emperor. The lesson is that coming incredibly close, inflicting mortal wounds, gaining physical dominance, having the backing of chaos itself, is still not enough if the Emperor decides to stop holding back. To truly defeat the Emperor, you would need to either prevent him from ever reaching that point of full commitment or find a way to win before he can make that choice. There is one more element of the Horus story that deserves careful attention before we move on, because it has significant implications for how we evaluate all the other candidates. The Emperor did not simply decide to strike Horus down in the moment he stopped holding back. He had been fighting in two places simultaneously throughout the entire siege of Terra, physically present on the Golden Throne, maintaining the psychic defenses of Terra, and psychically present in the Warp, fighting the very forces of chaos who were empowering Horus. The duel on the Vengeful Spirit was a third front, opened only at the very end when the walls had already fallen, and there was no other option. This means the Emperor, when he finally faced Horus, was not fresh. He was not at the peak of a long rest, fully charged and prepared. He had been fighting a three-front psychic and military war for years, sustained by the sacrifice of thousands of psychers and the force of will of a being who had been preparing for this moment for his entire extraordinary lifetime. The wounds Horus inflicted, the broken spine, the missing eye, the burned face, the torn arm, were wounds sustained by an already exhausted being. Not the sprinting athlete at his fastest, but the marathon runner in the final mile, still moving, still pushing, but operating far below what he was capable of at full capacity. What the Emperor demonstrated on the Vengeful Spirit was not his ceiling, it was his floor, the absolute minimum of what he could produce at the end of his endurance after everything had been spent. And his floor was still sufficient to erase a being empowered by 4 chaos gods from existence with a single strike. If that is the floor, what would the ceiling look like? The lore gives us glimpses. During the Unification Wars on Terra, before the Great Crusade had even begun, the Emperor fought battles that have been described in terms so extreme that later scholars dismiss them as mythological. He moved faster than any vehicle. He brought down warships with psychic blasts when pushed. He was not wounded by weapons that would have destroyed any normal being, not because the weapons failed to land, but because the wounds simply did not persist the way they should have. That Emperor, the Emperor of the Unification Wars, at his full operational strength, with nothing held back and no emotional complications, is probably the most powerful individual combatant that has ever existed in the 40,000 setting. And whether any Primarch could challenge that specific version under any circumstances is a question to which the most honest answer is almost certainly not. Section 4. Magnus the Red. The mind that almost matched God. Magnus the Red is the most intellectually interesting candidate in this conversation, and possibly the most emotionally complex figure in the entire Warhammer 40,000 setting. He is the Primarch of the Thousand Sons, the 15th Legion, and he is the greatest natural psyker ever born among the Primarchs. His psychic abilities are so far in excess of any of his brothers that the comparison is almost meaningless, like asking how a particular storm compares to a gentle breeze. Magnus does not merely use psychic power. He is psychic power given physical form. His physical appearance reflected this truth from the moment of his birth. While other Primarchs were discovered as extraordinary infants with the potential for greatness, Magnus arrived in the world already expressing what he was. His skin was a deep, vivid copper red. He had a single cyclopean eye. The other had been sacrificed in a bargain he made with a warp entity he believed to be merely a powerful but manageable force, though it was almost certainly Tzeentch himself, setting the first stones in a trap that would take centuries to fully spring. His presence generated a visible aura of crackling psychic energy that even baseline humans could perceive. When he landed on Prospero, the colony world of outcast human psychers that became his home after the Chaos Gods scattered the Primarchs from the Emperor's laboratory, he was already extraordinary. Prospero was a world where psychic ability was commonplace, where the scholars who governed the planet were themselves formidable psychers with centuries of accumulated wisdom. Magnus surpassed their greatest masters as a child, not gradually, not over years of careful study, but almost immediately. One of the most important moments in understanding Magnus's psychic nature is described in early Prospero lore. While the scholars of Prospero studied the warp by drawing carefully from it, Like scientists taking controlled samples, Magnus looked into it, directly, fully. He did not draw from the warp. He submerged himself in it completely and emerged intact, understanding things that should have broken him. This is what makes Magnus genuinely unlike any other Primarch. His relationship with psychic power is not one of skilled application. It is one of fundamental comprehension. He understands the warp on a level that almost no other being in existence approaches. The Emperor exceeds him, and the gap is real and significant. But among mortal origin beings, Magnus is virtually without peer. When the Emperor arrived on Prospero and found his lost son, what followed was not the usual pattern of discovery and integration into the Great Crusade. What happened between the Emperor and Magnus was something rarer, two genuinely like minds finding each other across an impossible gulf of age and power. They spent solar decades in joint study of the warp, the Emperor sharing knowledge with Magnus that he shared with no other Primarch, the two of them exploring the depths of psychic science together. This relationship, this genuine intellectual and psychic kinship, is the heart of why Magnus is such a complicated figure, and why the question of whether he could ever defeat his father is so rich with nuance. Because Magnus was genuinely the closest to the Emperor in terms of raw psychic potential among all the Primarchs, not just the closest, he was in a class by himself that was still meaningfully below the Emperor's level, but that was not the same as being entirely out of reach. Other sources consistently describe Magnus as the most powerful psyker in the galaxy after the Emperor himself, and note that certain Citan or Chaos gods may approach or exceed his power, but among beings of mortal origin, or formerly mortal origin, Magnus is the peak of what natural psychic development can produce. What could Magnus actually do? The list is extraordinary. Telepathy across galactic distances. He communed with the Emperor via psychic connection before they had physically met, reaching across the void between Prospero and wherever the Emperor's crusade happened to be at the time. Telekinesis of such power that he could rend apart battle tanks and Titan-class war machines with thought alone. Reality warping, not just affecting probability or nudging events, but actually altering the fundamental nature of the physical world around him. The ability to reach into the warp and shape it, to manifest constructs of psychic energy so solid and powerful they could affect the physical world. Precognition that operated on a scale most psychers could not match. The ability to project his consciousness across the galaxy, to appear in distant places as a full psychic presence. And after his ascension to Demon Primarch status, after he gave himself fully to Tzeentch and was transformed into a creature of the warp wearing physical flesh, those abilities expanded into something even more extraordinary. As a Demon Primarch, Magnus stands perhaps 40 feet tall, a towering cyclops of crimson and fire, his wings vast enough to blot out the sky. He carries weapons of legendary power, the blade of An-Nunurta, a force sword of staggering potency. But the weapons are almost beside the point. Magnus as Demon Primarch is a psychic force of nature who can reshape the world around him at will. He can reach into the minds of enemies and shatter them. He can unravel the physical laws of reality in his immediate vicinity. He can communicate with the fabric of the warp itself, and draw upon reserves of power that would have been inaccessible to his mortal form. There is a specific incident from the later stages of the Horus Heresy that is deeply relevant to our question. After the burning of Prospero, after Leman Russ and the Space Wolves destroyed his home world and shattered his legion, driven there by Horus's manipulation of Russ's hatred for Magnus's sorcery, Magnus appeared in the Imperial dungeon on Terra. He came through the webway, having used a psychic ritual to sap the Emperor's remaining strength, attempting to manifest demonic allies inside the Sanctum Imperialis itself. What makes this incident remarkable is what happened when Vulcan confronted him. Vulcan, the physically strongest of the Primarchs and a perpetual who cannot be killed, engaged Magnus in a sustained battle within the walls of the Emperor's own palace. And Magnus nearly won. He beheaded Vulcan. He suffocated him by transmuting his lungs to amber. He drained his blood and immolated him with psychic fire. He tried every method he could think of to permanently end Vulcan, and each time the Perpetual regenerated and came back. But the crucial detail here is not that Magnus failed to kill Vulcan. The crucial detail is that Magnus, fighting at less than his full power in the Materium, came so close to killing an effectively unkillable Primarch that Vulcan required the sacrifice of one of his warriors to finally drive Magnus back. Now, was the Emperor right there, within psychic reach? Was Magnus trying to fight his way to the Golden Throne? Yes. And the key detail from this encounter is that Magnus was performing a ritual specifically designed to drain the Emperor's remaining strength, while simultaneously using the webway breach to corrupt the dungeon with demonic presence. He was not trying to fight the Emperor directly. He was trying to weaken him, to bleed away his power before the killing blow. This is Magnus's instinct, and it is a psychically intelligent one. Magnus knows he cannot match the Emperor in raw output. He has always known this. The Emperor told him as much during their years of study together. But Magnus is not a being who wins through raw output. He wins through strategy, preparation, and the application of overwhelming force at exactly the right vector. The question of whether a fully prepared Magnus, Daemon Primarch, backed by Tzeentch, with months or years of preparation to lay groundwork, could defeat the Emperor is genuinely complicated, more so than any of the other candidates. The consistent position in the lore is that Magnus is a lesser psyker than the Emperor, but the Emperor's lore also makes it clear that he has vulnerabilities. The webway incident demonstrated that sustained psychic pressure on specific targets could drain his reserves. The Draken Yen demon's wound during the war in the webway nearly ended him, requiring a complete sacrifice of the day's psyker supply to even temporarily free him from the Golden Throne. Magnus in full Demon Prince form, backed by a chaos god of cosmic proportions, is not merely a Primarch anymore. He is a partial avatar of Tzeentch. He carries within him a fragment of a god's will and power. The gap between him and the Emperor, while real, is not so vast that it becomes a laughable mismatch in all circumstances. Where Magnus falls short is in one crucial area. His power as a demon prince is significant in the warp, and when the barriers between the Materium and Immaterium are thin. In real space, without the warp's presence flooding through him, he is limited to the impressive but still finite abilities of his mortal form expressed at maximum capacity. The Emperor, by contrast, is powered by humanity itself, by the psychic resonance of billions of human souls worshipping him as a god, and this source of power is not dependent on warp proximity in the same way. The verdict on Magnus: he is the closest to the Emperor's level in terms of psychic capability, and under the right circumstances, weakened Emperor, warp-thick environment, extensive preparation, Tzeentch's backing at full strength, he might represent a genuine threat. But in a straight confrontation, even accounting for all those advantages, the Emperor's reserves are simply deeper. Magnus's path to victory would involve never engaging in a direct fight at all. It would involve being a siege engine, not a duelist, grinding the Emperor down across multiple vectors simultaneously, the way he tried to do during the webway incursion, which is exactly what Chaos was trying to accomplish throughout the entire Horus heresy, using Horus as the battering ram while other tools chipped away at the foundations. The problem is that the battering ram failed, and without the decisive strike, the siege cannot succeed. There is one more dimension of Magnus's candidacy that deserves serious consideration. As a demon prince of Tzeentch, Magnus does not merely have access to the Chaos God's power, he has access to Tzeentch's knowledge. And Tzeentch is, among the four Chaos Gods, the one most specifically concerned with plans, plots, and the manipulation of outcomes across vast stretches of time. Tzeentch can see possible futures, not with the clarity and completeness that might be implied by the phrase. The warp does not work that way, and even a god of change cannot perfectly predict the infinite branching of possibility, but with a breadth and depth of foresight that far exceeds what any mortal, or even most immortal beings can achieve. And Magnus, as Tzeentch's champion and demon prince, has access to fragments of that foresight. This means Magnus can, in principle, see things coming. He can prepare for contingencies that other beings would not even know to consider. He can build plans within plans, layer his approaches in ways that make each apparent defeat actually a step in a deeper strategy. This is not unique to Magnus among the traitor Primarchs. Tzeentch's gift of foresight and planning extends to varying degrees to all his servants. But Magnus is the one best positioned to actually use it effectively, because he has the intelligence and the psychic capability to translate that foresight into real advantage. The Emperor, of course, also has access to significant predictive capability. He can see the future, or at least the probable shapes of it. He has been using his foresight to navigate impossible situations for tens of thousands of years. The psychic chess match between Magnus's Tzeentchian future sight and the Emperor's own precognitive abilities is itself a battle that would play out across dimensions that most beings cannot even perceive. But here is the interesting question: whose foresight is more useful? The Emperor's predictive abilities are powerful, but have specific blind spots. He did not, for instance, foresee all the consequences of placing Horus in the role of War Master, even with his extraordinary planning capabilities. His vision of the future was always filtered through his strategic priorities and his specific blind spots about human nature and motivation. Magnus, operating through Tzeentch, has access to a different kind of future sight, one that is specifically tuned to finding the angles and unexpected approaches that other planners miss. In a pure battle of wits and strategy played out over centuries, Magnus versus the Emperor might be the most evenly matched GWA test in the setting. Neither would win quickly, neither would win cleanly. And the outcome might genuinely be uncertain in a way that no other pairing in this conversation can claim. Section 5. Vulcan, the immortal problem nobody can solve. Here is the thing about Vulcan that makes him uniquely interesting in this conversation. He is the only candidate whose path to victory does not actually require him to win. Let me explain. Every other Primarch who might challenge the Emperor has to somehow overcome the problem of the Emperor's superior power within a finite time frame. They have to hit harder, move faster, bring more psychic force to bear, or exploit some specific vulnerability before the Emperor can respond with full capacity. The window for victory is narrow for everyone else, and the margin for error is essentially zero. Vulcan does not have this problem. Vulcan cannot die. He is a perpetual, just like the Emperor himself. His cellular regeneration is so complete and so thorough that it operates on a level that essentially defies the normal rules of biological destruction. Konrad Curze, the Night Haunter, one of the most creative and sadistic killers in the galaxy, spent months systematically trying to kill Vulcan in every way imaginable. He cut his head off. He tore him limb from limb. He eviscerated him, shot him with hundreds of bolters at close range, threw him naked into the vacuum of space, and left him in the venting shaft of a starship's plasma engine. Each time, Vulcan came back. Every time, without exception. When Vulcan learned to consciously accelerate his regeneration, to actively control the process rather than simply letting it happen on its own, he discovered he could come back so fast that he was regenerating before he had even finished falling. Curze shot his head off during a chase across a city, and Vulcan was back on his feet before his headless body hit the ground. Now, the Emperor is also a perpetual. He can also regenerate. But Vulcan's regeneration and the Emperor's regeneration are not equivalent processes. And this is where the theoretical fight between them becomes genuinely fascinating. The Emperor's regenerative ability is currently suppressed, or at least the active expression of it is, by the Golden Throne. This is one of the most debated topics in 40K lore, and the answer is genuinely uncertain. Some interpretations hold that the Emperor could theoretically regenerate from the Golden Throne if freed from it, but that the throne's mechanisms are not designed to facilitate biological healing, only to sustain a minimum level of life function. Other interpretations suggest that the Emperor's wounds from Horus are simply too severe for regeneration to overcome, that the psychic damage done to his soul during the fight on the Vengeful Spirit was sufficient to prevent the perpetual healing from functioning properly. This is ultimately unknowable with certainty, given the current state of the lore, but what we can say with confidence is this. In a physical confrontation with a non-degraded Emperor, the Emperor at his Great Crusade era peak, walking and fighting and fully present, Vulcan's immortality creates a problem with no clean solution. You cannot win a fight against Vulcan by killing him. You can kill him over and over, and it accomplishes nothing. He comes back. He always comes back. To permanently end Vulcan requires a fulgurite, a specific material, essentially a petrified bolt of the Emperor's own psychic power, formed where the Emperor's lightning struck the earth in ancient times. This is the one weapon confirmed by the lore to be capable of genuinely and permanently killing a perpetual. John Grammaticus killed Vulcan with a fulgurite shard, trading away his own perpetual nature in the process, stabbing it into Vulcan's heart to fulfill a mission laid on him by the alien Cabal organization, who believed that Vulcan's death was necessary to prevent a specific chain of events. The Emperor would presumably know about fulgurite. He would presumably be able to construct or obtain it. His own psychic power is the source material for the stuff. But in a straight fight, without pre-planned preparation, without fulgurite at hand, Vulcan is the problem that keeps coming back. Every time you kill him, you have accomplished nothing except given him a short break before he is back on his feet and angrier than before. This matters because it changes the calculus of any fight between Vulcan and the Emperor in a specific way. The Emperor cannot simply outfight Vulcan and be done with it. He would need to either obtain and deploy the specific counter to perpetual regeneration, or he would need to do what he did to Horus, soul annihilate him. Erase every trace of Vulcan's existence from the warp itself, leaving nothing for the regenerative process to anchor to. Could the Emperor do this to Vulcan? Almost certainly, if fully committed and fully prepared, but the same qualification applies here as it did to Horus. Fully committed, fully prepared. If the Emperor is once again in the position of fighting someone he cares about, and the lore is clear that the Emperor genuinely cared for Vulcan more than most of his sons, seeing in the Salamander's Primarch a kind of moral anchor and proof of his own good intentions, then the hesitation problem reemerges. But let us consider Vulcan's offensive capabilities more carefully, because this is where the argument gets complicated in a different direction. Vulcan is described across multiple sources as the physically strongest of the Primarchs. This is a genuinely contested claim. Angron, Layman Russ, and Lyon L. Johnson all have strong cases to make. But there is consistent lore support for Vulcan being at the very top of the physical spectrum. In the contest between the Emperor and Vulcan on Nocturne, when the Emperor came to reclaim his lost son, the two of them tested each other in a multi-day competition of strength, endurance, craftsmanship, and hunting skill. The competition ended essentially as a tie, with neither being clearly the superior. Let that sink in. The Emperor of mankind, the being who has spent 48,000 years developing every conceivable form of physical capability, went up against the Salamander's Primarch in a contest of physical prowess and could not decisively win. The Emperor's triumph came in the final hunt, and even then it was Vulcan's choice to acknowledge the stranger's superiority rather than a crushing physical defeat. Vulcan's weapons and armor are, of course, extraordinary. He is a master craftsman of the highest order, and his personal equipment is among the finest in existence. The Dawnbringer, his great thunderhammer, his armor, constructed to withstand conditions that would destroy almost any other material. The Spear of Vulcan, a weapon of such heat and force that it can burn through almost any defense. But these weapons, however impressive, are not what makes Vulcan dangerous in this conversation. What makes him dangerous is the combination of physical power, perpetual regeneration, and a specific quality that distinguishes him from almost every other Primarch: patience. Vulcan is not hot-headed. He is not driven by rage, like Angron, or by pride, like Fulgrim, or by ambition, like Horus. He is patient, methodical. He has lived through torture and death more times than almost any being in history, and he has emerged from each cycle stronger and clearer. He knows how to endure. He knows how to wait for the right moment. A fight between Vulcan and the Emperor would not be a duel. It would be a war of attrition, and Vulcan is the undisputed master of that particular kind of warfare. He cannot be worn down by casualties. He cannot be demoralized by suffering. He cannot be hurried or panicked. The Emperor would eventually win such a conflict. The soul annihilation option exists, and the Emperor has the psychic power to execute it, but it would cost him enormously. And if the Emperor were already weakened, as he was during the Siege of Terra, or operating under the drain of the Golden Throne as he currently is, then the calculation shifts. Vulcan's path to victory is not to overpower the Emperor. It is to make the cost of defeating him so high that even the Emperor cannot afford to pay it. It is to turn the fight into something that drains the Emperor's reserves until what remains is not enough to deliver the killing blow. In a healthy Emperor scenario, Vulcan loses, eventually. The Emperor has the tools to end perpetuals, but in a weakened Emperor scenario, Vulcan might be the one candidate whose strategy, not speed, not power, but the endless patient application of pressure, could eventually exhaust even a god. There is something else about Vulcan that tends to get lost in pure power-level discussions, and it is relevant here. Vulcan is the Primarch who has died and returned more times than any other being in recorded history. He has experienced death in practically every form imaginable. He has been beheaded, suffocated, burned, frozen, poisoned, shot, stabbed, and thrown into space. He has died in ways that would have ended any other being permanently. What this means for his psychology is remarkable. Death holds no terror for Vulcan, not because he is brave in the ordinary sense, though he is extraordinarily so, but because he has literally experienced it dozens of times and knows that it simply is not the end for him. This removes from any opponent the most powerful psychological weapon that combat has to offer, the threat of death as a deterrent. Most fighters, even very experienced ones, have some level of survival instinct that creates hesitation. Even other Primarchs, who are not afraid of death in the way mortals are, have some degree of self-preservation calculation built into their fighting instinct. Vulcan does not. He can throw himself at any threat with complete, absolute commitment, because the worst possible outcome, his death, is simply not a permanent consequence for him. This makes him terrifying in a specific way that pure strength numbers do not capture. An enemy fighting Vulcan must accept that he will keep coming, not just keep fighting despite wounds, keep coming back after dying. The psychological impact of fighting someone who cannot be permanently removed from the field, who will return again and again and again, more patient each time, more certain of eventual victory, is its own form of attrition. The Emperor would know this. He presumably designed it. He is a perpetual himself, and understands what it means to be one. The question is whether the Emperor, even knowing what Vulcan is, could dispatch him quickly enough to prevent the attrition from mounting. At peak power, probably yes. In the current era, with the Golden Throne constraining everything, probably not. Vulcan also carries something else into this fight, the Promethean philosophy. The circle of fire and rebirth, of destroying what cannot be saved so that something better can grow from the ashes. Vulcan has always been the Primarch most willing to make the terrible sacrifice, to destroy what matters to him when doing so serves a greater purpose. He killed Ferrus Manus' creation to prevent it from falling to chaos. He was willing to strike down Magnus when the Emperor ordered it. He has never flinched from the hard choice when it was the necessary one. In a fight with the Emperor, not a fight of betrayal or rebellion, but a fight born of absolute loyalty, pushed to its most extreme possible conclusion. Vulcan would be the candidate who could do what needed to be done without the hesitation that mercy, or love, or respect might otherwise produce. He would grieve, he would mourn. And then he would come back one more time and do what fire does to things that have served their purpose, reduce them to ash so something new can grow. Section 6, Angron, the Red Angel, the demon that broke the palace. Angron is the tragedy at the heart of Warhammer 40k's greatest tragedy. Every other fallen Primarch had some degree of agency in their descent. Fulgrim was seduced slowly, drawn in by the promise of perfection, making choices at each step that led him deeper into Slaanesh's embrace. Horus was manipulated, but he was also proud, also ambitious, also willing to let himself believe the vision of the galaxy that Chaos showed him. Magnus was reckless, arrogant in his brilliance, choosing to break the Emperor's strictures because he believed he knew better. Angron had the Butcher's nails hammered into his head before he was old enough to prevent it. The Butcher's nails were crude psychosurgical implants originally developed by the slavers of Nuceria to control gladiatorial fighters. They worked by stimulating the neural pathways associated with aggression and combat, while simultaneously suppressing the reward centers of the brain associated with peace, pleasure, and connection. The effect was to make the implanted individual feel a constant grinding pain that was only relieved by violence. Every moment of calm was suffering. Every moment of battle was bliss. Over time, the nails ate into the brain, destroying the neural tissue that connected to deeper emotional processing, to empathy, to the capacity for complex relationship. They were killing Angron slowly. The Emperor examined the nails and determined that by the time Angron came to him, They had already grown too deeply into his brain for removal, without fatal damage to be possible. The man who might have been, the Primarch who, according to the scattered hints throughout the Horus Heresy novels, may have been one of the most empathetic beings ever born, possibly capable of literally feeling the pain of others, was already dying long before the heresy began. The nails were just making it slow. This context matters immensely when we ask whether Angron could defeat the Emperor, because Angron, uncorrupted, without the nails, might have been a different conversation entirely. He might have been a Primarch of extraordinary compassion and strength, who engaged with the question of his own power honestly, and without the burning resentment that eventually made him the most purely destructive of the traitors. But that Angron never existed in the lore we have. The Angron we know is the one who was betrayed at every turn, whose natural emotional connections were systematically destroyed by implants designed to turn him into a weapon, who came to the Emperor already half broken and was never truly healed. The Emperor knew the nails were killing Angron. He chose not to tell him. When Angron became a demon prince of Khorne, through a ritual performed by Lorgar during the Shadow Crusade, as the nails were finally about to kill his mortal body, the transformation preserved what the nails had made him, while amplifying every aspect of his already extraordinary physical power to something that challenges the imagination. As a Daemon Primarch, Angron is enormous. His demonic form stands at a scale that makes his already massive mortal frame seem almost quaint. His bat-like wings spanning distances that dwarf battle tanks. His skin the deep red-black of dried blood, covered in brass sigils and the marks of Khorne's favor. He carries the Black Blade, a runezord of terrible power, and his physical capabilities are such that even other demon Primarchs treat him as a direct threat. His assault on the Imperial Palace during the Siege of Terra was one of the most harrowing passages in the entire Horus Heresy novel series. Angron pushed through defenses that had stopped everything else. He fought through the Blood Angel's heroic last stand at the Eternity Gate with such pure, devastating force that even the legendary warriors of Sanguinius's legion were barely slowing him down. He fought Sanguinius himself in the air above the gate, a battle between two of the most fearsome warriors in history, and in that fight, he managed to impale Sanguinius on his Black Blade. The cost was significant. Sanguinius, even wounded from earlier fighting, managed to rip out Angron's butcher's nails in the moment of her death, causing Angron's demonic form to explode from the psychic backlash and banishing him to the warp temporarily. But consider what had just happened. Angron, essentially alone, had fought through the finest defenders in the Imperium, including one of the greatest warrior Primarchs who ever lived, and ended the battle by killing his opponent. In the 41st millennium, we see Angron's capabilities in even more dramatic terms. During the First War of Armageddon, Angron led a massive invasion of the Hive world with an army of demons and World Eater's Chaos Space Marines. His personal combat performance was such that the Grey Knights, the most elite demon hunting force in the Imperium, specifically designed and empowered to face exactly this kind of threat, required every resource they had and suffered near total casualties to banish him back to the warp. Not kill him, banish him. More recently in the current 42nd millennium lore, Angron confronted Chapter Master Dante of the Blood Angels and essentially defeated him in single combat, mauling the legendary commander so severely that he nearly died, and was only prevented from finishing the job by the arrival of Lionel Johnson. Against the Lion, a Primarch who is considered among the very greatest melee fighters ever to have existed, Angron's performance was extraordinary. The Lion is stronger, faster, and more technically skilled than almost any being who has ever lived. He managed to ultimately defeat Angron by exploiting the Red Angel's mindless fury and landing a precise, decapitating blow. But the fight was real. It was not easy. It was a genuine clash between powers at the extreme end of what is possible. Here is what makes Angron uniquely dangerous against the Emperor specifically. The Emperor, for all his power, is a psychic combatant first and a physical combatant second. His victories in direct confrontation have relied heavily on psychic force, on the ability to project warp energy as weapons, to manipulate probability, to reach into souls. His physical combat abilities are extraordinary, but the decisive moments in his legendary fights, when he bested Leman Russ in their contest on Fenris, when he destroyed Horus at the end, were psychic rather than purely physical. Angron, as a demon prince of Khorne, benefits from something deeply relevant to this: Khorne's hatred of sorcery. The blood god despises psychic power, and his champions receive some degree of protection against it, not as an absolute ward, but as a resistance that makes them harder to damage through purely psychic means than most beings. Khorne's own domain in the warp actively opposes the kind of psychic force the Emperor would naturally bring to bear. This is not a perfect counter. The Emperor's psychic power is not merely sorcery in the way Khorne defines it. His abilities draw from deeper sources than the chaos-tainted warp, and the Emperor's specific form of psychic force is different in kind from the warp sorcery that Khorne most directly opposes. But it does mean that Angron, of all the candidates, is the one who poses the most credible physical threat to the Emperor, while simultaneously being somewhat resistant to the Emperor's primary mode of attack. Against an Emperor at peak power, fully committed, and prepared for a direct fight, Angron would almost certainly lose. The Emperor's psychic capabilities are sufficient to overcome even Khorne's resistance, given enough force, and the soul annihilation option remains available. But Angron is not trying to win a duel. Angron is not, on some level, capable of trying to win a duel in the chess match, strategic sense. He is trying to kill everything in front of him with every ounce of force he possesses, until either everything is dead or he is dead. And in that context, in the context of pure, uncontrollable, destructive force applied without hesitation, he is the most dangerous candidate for a specific reason. The Emperor cannot hesitate against Angron. There is no version of Angron that the Emperor might want to save. There is no thread of hope that the real Angron is still in there somewhere, waiting to be reached. The nails destroyed that Angron long before the Chaos Gods finished the job. Against Horus, the Emperor's hesitation was his greatest vulnerability. Against Angron, that particular vulnerability does not exist, which means the Emperor would commit immediately, which means the fight would be decided by pure power. And in a pure power fight, even after everything we have discussed about Angron's capabilities, the Emperor should still win. Should, probably. Under normal circumstances. Under abnormal circumstances, a Golden Throne Emperor, weakened and half-dead, forced to fight because Angron has physically ripped his way through to the throne room on Terra, the answer becomes much less certain. But there is something even more disturbing about Angron as a candidate, something that has to do with the specific nature of his connection to Khorne. Angron, as a demon prince, is not merely a servant of Khorne, he is one of the most beloved of the Blood God's champions. Khorne feeds on blood and skulls and the act of killing, on the psychic resonance of violence and death rippling through the warp and the materium simultaneously. Every kill Angron makes is a sacrifice to his patron god. Every battle he fights is an act of worship, and the Blood God rewards acts of worship. This creates a feedback loop that makes Angron harder to fight the longer a conflict continues. As a battle extends, as the body count mounts, as the suffering and violence reach a certain threshold of intensity, Khorne's attention focuses more completely on the fight. His champion receives more of his god's attention. And Khorne's attention is not merely a spiritual blessing. It is a tangible infusion of warp power into his champion that makes every subsequent blow harder, every wound he sustains less significant, every attempt to stop him less effective. In a short, decisive engagement, the Emperor's superior power wins. In a sustained, drawn-out battle of attrition, where the body count creates increasingly favorable conditions for Angron, especially if that battle is happening near the warp, near sources of cornate resonance, near anything that feeds the feedback loop, the margin shrinks with every death. This is why Angron chose to fight the way he did during the Siege of Terra. He was not working toward a clever tactical objective. He was making offerings. He was making the entire battle a sacrifice. He was making his eventual assault on the Emperor himself, an act of worship so saturated with blood and death that by the time he reached the throne room, if he ever had, Khorne might have been standing at his shoulder in ways that would have changed the fight entirely. He never made it to the Emperor. Sanguinius stopped him at the Eternity Gate and died doing it. And then Sanguinius's death, that specific terrible death, the death of the most beloved of the Emperor's sons, unraveled something in the Blood Angels that became the Black Rage, a genetic curse that has echoed through 10,000 years of their history. One wonders what it says about Angron that his single greatest act of violence during the siege of Terra was not merely killing an enemy, it was breaking a lineage. It was embedding a wound so deep in the Blood Angel's genetic memory that it can still be felt today, 10 millennia later, in every warrior who falls to the rage and relives those final moments above the Eternity Gate. That is not merely power. That is a kind of terrible significance that goes beyond combat capability into something that shapes the lore of the setting itself. Section 7. Lionel Johnson. The Primarch built to kill gods. Lionel Johnson is, in several important ways, the most underrated candidate in this entire conversation. And that is partly by design. The lion is secretive by nature. He was raised alone in the death forests of Caliban with no human contact for his earliest years, before being discovered by the Knights of the Order, who became his first companions. He has never learned to perform his greatness for an audience. While Horus was charismatic and magnetic, while Magnus was brilliant and verbose, while Guilliman was systematic and public, the lion simply did his work and kept his own counsel about the extent of what he was capable of. This has led to a persistent underestimation of him in fan discussions, and that underestimation is a mistake. Let us start with the raw data. Among all the Primarchs, the lion is consistently described in the lore as among the very finest warriors. His tactical genius is rated by characters like Guilliman, himself one of the greatest military minds in history, as exceptional even by Primarch standards. His physical combat abilities are in the top tier, faster than almost any of his brothers, technically more skilled than most, with a dueling precision that few can match. His weapons are worthy of mention. During the Horus Heresy, he carried the Lion's Blade, a weapon so legendary that it still persists in the lore 10,000 years later, now in the possession of Cypher, the mysterious fallen angel whose true allegiance nobody has ever fully determined. The Lion's Blade was an artifact of such power that its destruction in the fighting on Caliban is treated as a genuine loss to the forces of order. In the current lore of the 41st millennium, the lion is now wielding the Emperor's shield, the same class of artifact gifted by the Emperor himself, matching the one carried by Guilliman, alongside a new blade called Fealty. The Emperor's shield is significant. It is not merely a physical object. It is an expression of the Emperor's own power, an artifact constructed with the kind of craftsmanship and psychic investment that only the master of mankind is capable of. That the Emperor himself deemed the lion worthy of such a gift speaks to a specific kind of recognition. But it is the lion's less discussed qualities that make him the most interesting theoretical opponent for the Emperor. Lionel Johnson is the only Primarch in the lore who, when specifically targeted by the powers of chaos and offered everything that chaos can offer, was found to have literally nothing inside him that Tzeentch could use as leverage. This moment occurs during the Thramis Crusade, when the lion encountered Kairos Fateweaver, the Oracle of Tzeentch, one of the most powerful greater demons in existence, a being of cosmic intelligence who has seen all of time and knows the hidden desires and fears of every soul. Fateweaver's entire method of operation is to find the thing that a target wants, fears, or craves most deeply, and use it. He had done this to countless victims. He attempted it with the lion. He found nothing. Not an absence of desire or ambition, the lion had both, but an absence of anything that chaos could reach. His loyalty to the Emperor was so absolute, so foundational to his identity, that it could not be used against him. His pride could not be redirected. His resentments could not be weaponized. His loneliness, and the lion was profoundly, deeply lonely, isolated by his own secretive nature from the genuine connection he craved, could not be exploited. The lion dismissed the Lord of Change by impaling it through the heart, and, with what might be the best piece of dialogue in the Thramis Crusade arc, commenting that he should have seen that coming. Psychic immunity, or more precisely psychic resistance, is relevant to the Emperor fight in a specific way. If the Emperor's greatest weapon against a foe like Horus was the psychic destruction of the soul, the final strike that erased him from existence, then a target whose psychic defenses are unusually robust changes the equation somewhat. The lion is not immune to psychic attack. He does not have the corn-based resistance that Angron benefits from, but he has a quality that amounts to psychic fortitude, an inner coherence, a clarity of identity that makes him harder to reach through the kinds of soul-level attacks that the Emperor prefers. His mind cannot be turned against him. His will cannot be broken. Now, this does not mean the Emperor's psychic lance cannot kill him. It almost certainly still can, if directed with enough force at the physical level rather than the metaphysical. But it does mean that the Emperor cannot use the same toolkit against the lion that he used against Horus. He cannot find the crack in the lion's soul and reach through it. He would need to approach the problem differently. What is the lion's combat ceiling in physical terms? This is established most clearly by his Return-era performance in current 40k lore. He fought Ongron, a demon prince of Khorne, empowered by the blood god, essentially in his home territory in terms of psychic resonance, and defeated him. Not easily. The fight was brutal. Angron is arguably the most physically destructive combatant in the setting. But the lion managed it, first penetrating Ongron's defenses with his power sword fealty, then decapitating him with the edge of the Emperor's shield while the Red Angel was briefly incapacitated. Defeating a demon Primarch in direct combat is an achievement that very few beings in the lore can claim. The lion has done it, and he did it without perpetual regeneration, without Chaos God backing, without any special counter to Angron's specific abilities. He did it with skill, patience, and tactical discipline applied to one of the most savage opponents in the galaxy. What would the lion do against the Emperor? He would not charge. That is the first thing to understand about how the lion fights. He is not Ongron, throwing himself at the problem with maximum force and rage. He observes, he calculates, he identifies the optimal moment and the optimal strike. His preference for winning cleanly and decisively, rather than brawling his way to a messy victory, means he approaches every fight as a problem to be solved. Against the Emperor, the lion's theoretical path to victory would involve sustained, brilliant, technically precise pressure, using his exceptional speed to prevent the Emperor from settling into a psychic rhythm, staying close enough that large-scale psychic attacks would risk damage to the Emperor himself, reading the fight the way only a consummate duelist can. He would not try to outlast the Emperor. He would try to find the specific moment when the Emperor's defenses aligned in a way that left an opening and drive his blade through it with everything he had. Can this actually work? Against a fully healthy Emperor at peak power, almost certainly not. The speed and precision required to find and exploit a genuine opening in the Emperor's defenses, before the Emperor simply ends the fight on the psychic level, is probably beyond even the lion's extraordinary abilities. But here is the interesting element. The lion is the returned Primarch, who the lore seems to be positioning most explicitly as a direct counter to the forces of chaos in the current era. His role in the narrative is not simply to fight Xenos and heretics. His role is, increasingly, to confront the divine. He fought and banished Angron. He wields the Emperor's shield, an artifact that specifically embodies the Emperor's power. He has demonstrated complete immunity to Chaos's standard toolkit. The lore of the current era is not done with the lion yet, and the direction it seems to be moving places him in a position of significance that none of the other living Primarchs hold. Whether that significance ever translates into an actual confrontation with a divine-level adversary, whether the lion is being slowly built up towards something unthinkable, remains to be seen. But if any of the surviving loyal Primarchs could theoretically threaten the Emperor in a desperate galaxy-ending scenario, the lion is the most structurally positioned to make that fight credible. Let us talk about what the lion's return means in the context of this question, because the lore of the current 42nd millennium has been building something specific around him that cannot be ignored. When the lion returned, he came back changed, not in the way that Guilliman came back, restored, treated, brought to full capacity by the intervention of the Eldar god of the dead, but in a stranger, less defined way. He emerged from what appears to have been a liminal space between the Materium and the Warp, having spent time in what seemed like a recreation of the forests of Caliban. He does not remember all of it. He emerged not entirely certain of what he experienced. What he did emerge with was a new weapon, the Emperor's shield, and a quality of presence that makes the Custodes, the beings literally designed to be the Emperor's personal guard, treat him with a deference that goes beyond simple respect for a returned Primarch. There is something in how the lion carries himself in current lore that suggests an awareness of his role that even he may not fully articulate. He has fought en grand. He drove the word-bearers back from Wormwood. He has been fighting through the most chaotic regions of the Imperium Nihilus, the dark half of the galaxy where the Emperor's light barely reaches. And throughout all of it, there is a quality of purposefulness that distinguishes him from even the urgently active Guilliman. Guilliman is rebuilding. He is maintaining. He is the Imperium's manager in a crisis, the administrator who holds the structure together while the walls collapse around it. The Lion is hunting something. What he is hunting, what specific purpose drove him out of his forest between worlds, what the Watchers in the Dark were preparing him for, across 10 millennia of mysterious slumber, is not yet revealed in the lore. But the structural direction of the narrative has him moving towards something that involves the most profound questions of the Emperor's fate, the Golden Throne, and whether the Imperium's current form can survive what is coming. If the Lion were ever to fight the Emperor, not in rebellion, not in a moment of corruption, but in a moment of desperate, loving clarity, it would be the most tragic fight in the history of the setting. Two beings who were built for each other in a way. The first, the blade of pure loyalty and martial perfection, against the father whose vision created everything they both are, struggling with each other toward an outcome that serves neither of them, but might, just might, serve humanity. That fight, in the context of a lore that finally allows the Emperor's story to reach some kind of resolution, would not be about power. It would be about will, about purpose, about whether the kind of love that creates also has the capacity to let go. The Lion, of all the Primarchs, is the one who understands duty well enough and loves the Emperor's actual goals enough. Not the Emperor himself, but what the Emperor was trying to build, to do the necessary thing even when it cost him everything. That quality, more than any weapon or power level or combat statistic, is what makes him the most complete answer to our question. Section 8. Leman Russ, the Emperor's own executioner. There is a specific irony at the heart of the Leman Russ question that makes it the most philosophically interesting in the entire conversation. Leman Russ was the Emperor's chosen executioner, not in the casual sense that the Space Wolves were simply the Emperor's enforcement arm, though they were, and Russ carried out multiple execution-level missions against forces that had become unmanageable, including the entire civilization of the Thousand Suns on Prospero. In the deepest, most specific sense, Russ was the Primarch designated to carry out the most extreme possible actions that the Emperor needed to take, but could not be seen to take directly. The implication in the lore, discussed carefully and somewhat ambiguously across multiple sources, is that Russ may have been responsible for the fates of at least one of the two lost Primarchs, the 2nd and 11th, whose names and histories were erased so completely that even other Primarchs were forbidden to speak of them. The suggestion is that these brothers were not simply purged by the Emperor's decree. They were hunted and eliminated, quietly and without ceremony, by the one Primarch who could be trusted to carry out that kind of mission without asking questions or developing complications about it. This is Leman Russ's deepest nature, the faithful hound who kills what his master needs killed, without the emotional complexity that might make another Primarch hesitate. Now, the question is whether this absolute loyalty ever found a limit. Whether there was a point at which even Leman Russ, the Emperor's most loyal son, the Wolf King who saw himself as the embodiment of his father's will, could turn that specific quality against its source. In physical combat, Russ is among the 3 or 4 most dangerous Primarchs who ever lived. His strength is staggering. He is specifically listed alongside Angron and Vulcan as one of the greatest physical warriors among the 20, and his feats bear this out. During the Battle of Prospero, when Leman Russ and the Space Wolves attacked Magnus the Red and the Thousand Suns, with the specific intent of bringing Magnus in for judgment, or destroying him if he refused, the two Primarchs fought. Magnus, the most powerful psyker in the galaxy after the Emperor, lost. Russ had him pinned, and was about to deliver the killing blow when Tzeentch intervened to save his future champion. Let that sink in. Leman Russ, in a straight fight, physically beat the Crimson King, the greatest natural psychic weapon in the galaxy, to the point where only divine intervention saved Magnus's life. This is not a small thing. Magnus had every possible advantage on Prospero. He had the home ground advantage. He had the full resources of his legion and centuries of psychic preparation. He had spent his entire life mastering every aspect of psychic warfare, and Russ, fighting in a rain of psychic fire, having already fought through an entire legion of sorcerer space marines, still won. His performance against Horus during the siege of Terra deserves its own examination. Russ intercepted Horus during the siege, specifically seeking a confrontation with the War Master. The fight between them was genuine and brutal. Horus, by this point empowered by 4 Chaos Gods and the power drawn from Molech, should have been effectively unbeatable in physical combat by any single Primarch. Russ wounded him, significantly, with a mortal-level blow to the neck that left Horus genuinely impaired. Horus, in turn, inflicted a wound on Russ that was not merely physical. The chaos-tainted lightning claw that Horus used left a spiritual wound that slowly drained Russ's vitality across the remaining days of the siege. This is important. It suggests that Horus's chaos-enhanced weapons could reach past conventional defenses to damage the soul itself. But the fact remains that Russ was willing to stand in front of Horus at the height of his corruption-enhanced power and trade blows. Russ's weapons are exceptional. The frost sword Mjolnir, a blade of legendary power whose history stretches back to the Age of Strife. The frost axe Hellwinter, made from the teeth of a massive sea creature Russ himself slew, an axe that can cleave through almost any armor. His warplate incorporates unique field generator technology that produces a constant aura of exothermic energy. Essentially, his armor actively damages anything that gets too close to him, making even contact difficult. And then there are his senses. Russ was raised by actual wolves on the death world of Fenris. His connection to his adopted animal family was not merely emotional or cultural, it was reflected in his physiology. He has senses that go far beyond even the enhanced perception of other Primarchs. A sense of smell that can track quarry across vast distances, hearing that can detect a heartbeat through solid walls, a capacity for reading body language and emotional state in other beings that borders on a low-level form of empathy. He cannot be surprised easily. He cannot be deceived physically. His predator's instincts operate continuously and without the kind of conscious attention that other fighters must devote to threat assessment. In a fight against someone who relies heavily on misdirection, on creating tactical illusions, on forcing an opponent to divide their attention across multiple threats simultaneously, someone like Magnus, for instance, or like the Emperor, in his most tactically complex combat mode, Russ's natural predator awareness is a genuine advantage. He processes the battlefield not as a series of conscious assessments, but as a felt, immediate understanding of where the threat is coming from and how to respond to it. His deepest qualification for this conversation is something that has been discussed in the lore and in fan spaces with increasing intensity as the current era of 40K has developed, the Wolf Time. Before Russ disappeared into the Eye of Terror, he stood before his assembled chapter at a feast and made a prophecy. He said, "In the end I will return for the final battle for the Wolf Time." The Wolf Time is drawn from Fenrisian mythology, the prophesied end of days, the final battle when the forces of darkness threaten to overwhelm everything. In Norse mythological terms, it is the equivalent of Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. The Space Wolves have kept faith with this prophecy for 10,000 years, maintaining their chapter and their traditions in the belief that their genetic father will return when the galaxy's need is greatest, to lead them in one final, apocalyptic battle. Here is the question that the Wolf Time raises, and it is a question that the lore has never directly answered. Who exactly is Leman Russ expected to fight at the Wolf Time? If the Wolf Time is Ragnarok, and Russ is the god warrior who survives Ragnarok to begin a new age, then the enemy he fights in the final battle might not be an external enemy. Ragnarok, in the original mythology, involves the death of gods, the end of one age and the beginning of another. Is it possible that Leman Russ's ultimate purpose, the deep final purpose that the Emperor encoded into him when he made the Wolf King the executioner of his own sons, is to be the one who ends the Emperor's current suffering? To be the one who, when the time finally comes and the lore reaches its climactic chapter, puts down the rotting god corpse on the golden throne and allows whatever comes next to actually arrive? This is speculation. This is fan theory territory, not established lore. The lore has never said this explicitly, but the structural logic is there. If any Primarch is built for the role of killing a god, not through power, not through cunning, but through the simple, terrible clarity of purpose and loyalty so absolute it has come around the other side to something almost indistinguishable from fate. It is the Wolf King. The Emperor beat Russ in their original contest on Fenris. That is the canonical account of their first meeting. But Russ has been fighting and learning for a very, very long time since then. And somewhere in the Eye of Terror, whatever he has been doing, whatever he has been hunting or fighting or becoming, he promised to come back for the final battle. The final battle has not happened yet. But there is something else about Leman Russ that rarely gets enough attention in these conversations. And it goes to the heart of what the Wolf-Time prophecy actually means for our question. Russ, throughout the Horus heresy, was tested in ways that most Primarchs were not. He was sent to burn Prospero, to destroy a world, an entire legion, and his own brother, on orders that turned out to have been manipulated by Horus. The Emperor wanted Magnus brought to justice. What Russ did was annihilate everything Magnus had built. He followed orders that were not quite the orders he thought he had been given, and the consequences were catastrophic. This experience did not break Russ, but it changed him. He came away from Prospero questioning something he had never questioned before, whether his absolute obedience to the Emperor's commands was itself a form of moral failure, whether being the perfect executioner of someone else's will, without the individual judgment to determine whether those commands were right, was a kind of abdication of the self. He did not resolve this question during the heresy. He continued fighting for the Emperor, continued believing in the fundamental righteousness of the cause, continued seeing himself as the loyal wolf who bit where his master pointed. But the question had been planted, and unlike some questions that fade with time, this one has had 10,000 years to grow in the dark of the Eye of Terror. When Leman Russ returns, if the lore allows him to return, and the Wolf-Time prophecy strongly suggests it will, he will not be the same Primarch who left. He will be a being who has spent more time than any of us can imagine wrestling with the deepest questions of loyalty and purpose. What does it mean to serve faithfully when faithfulness requires terrible actions? What does it mean to be loyal to someone's vision when the person who held that vision is no longer there in any meaningful sense to guide or confirm it? What do you do when the thing you were made to protect has become the thing that is preventing the goal you were made to serve? These are not abstract philosophical puzzles for Russ. They are the questions that have defined his entire existence as a Primarch, from Prospero to the present. And the answer he comes back with, whatever it is, will determine what the Wolf-Time actually is. If his answer is that the Emperor's survival on the throne, however diminished, represents a continuation of the mission that must be preserved at all costs, then Russ returns as the defender of the status quo, the wolf who howls against the dark one last time. If his answer is something different, if the 10,000 years in the eye have shown him something about the nature of chaos, about the warp, about what the Emperor actually needs in order for his dream to finally be realized, then the Wolf-Time becomes something stranger and more profound than a simple final battle. The Space Wolves have a tradition of mercy, of choosing the difficult, merciful path over the easy, ruthless one. Leman Russ fought Ongron to a standstill, partly to prevent him from having to be killed. He wrestled with the question of Magnus long before the burning of Prospero, and his reluctance to simply execute someone he viewed as a flawed but not irredeemable brother was what allowed Horus to manipulate the situation. He fought Horus himself and pulled the killing blow, even in that moment of desperate battle, because something in him could not quite bring himself to deliver the stroke that would have ended it. This is the deepest paradox of Leman Russ as a candidate. He is the Emperor's executioner, capable of killing even Primarchs. But he is also, at his core, the one who looks for a reason not to, the one who wants the messy, complicated, painful mercy over the clean, decisive kill. What the Wolf-Time asks of him, if the interpretation that has been building in the lore is correct, might be to finally reconcile these two natures, the executioner and the merciful wolf, the faithful servant and the questioning son, the weapon built for killing, who has spent an eternity learning to love. That reconciliation, whenever it comes, will determine whether Leman Russ is a candidate for defeating the Emperor, or the one who finds a third option that the lore has been slowly, quietly building toward across decades of storytelling. A third option that does not require a fight at all, but that gets into territory the lore has not written yet. And the beauty of Warhammer 40,000 is that it never quite finishes writing itself. Section 9. The case studies, scenarios where it might actually happen. Theory is one thing, but let us put the candidates into specific scenarios and see how the mathematics actually work out. Because this is not an abstract question. The Emperor's power level is not fixed. The Primarch's power levels are not fixed. Context matters enormously, and the right circumstances can flip the answer in ways that pure power rankings cannot capture. Scenario 1. The Emperor at peak power during the Great Crusade. This is the hardest version of the question. The Emperor in full operational health, not restrained by the Golden Throne, not weakened by years of sustained psychic defense, not making emotional calculations about sons he might be able to save. In this scenario, the honest answer is that no single Primarch wins. Horus comes closest, but only if you add the Malek power boost and full Chaos God backing, and even then he needs to fight a version of the Emperor who is holding back. Without the hesitation, without the emotional complication, a fully committed Great Crusade Emperor dispatches even chaos-empowered Horus as effectively as the dying Emperor on the Vengeful Spirit eventually did. The others are even less competitive in this scenario. Magnus is outclassed psychically in a direct contest. Angron has Khorne resistance, but not enough to overcome the raw differential. The Lion and Russ, for all their extraordinary martial skill, are fighting a being whose psychic capabilities allow him to operate outside the normal rules of physical combat. The only wrinkle is Vulcan. The Emperor at peak power still needs Fulgurite or Soul Annihilation to permanently deal with a Perpetual, and both require sustained effort that opens windows for the attritional strategy to function. The fight is still an Emperor win, but it is the least clean and most expensive Emperor win. Scenario 2. The Emperor on the Golden Throne, weakened and limited. This is the Emperor as he currently exists in the 41st millennium. A near-dead psychic ghost, sustained by technology and the devotion of billions, operating at a fraction of his former power, unable to take physical form, projecting his remaining capabilities through mechanisms and intermediaries rather than direct action. In this scenario, the power balance shifts dramatically. The Golden Throne Emperor is not a warrior. He is a psychic lighthouse and a warp defense mechanism. He cannot enter a duel. He cannot project himself onto a battlefield. To defeat him physically, you would need to first fight your way through the entire defense of the Imperial Palace, through the Adeptus Custodes, through the Sisters of Silence, through the various fortifications that have been built up around him over 10,000 years, and then, at the Golden Throne itself, deliver a blow sufficient to end both the physical life support and the psychic presence simultaneously. In this scenario, the calculus changes entirely. Angron, for instance, demonstrated during the Siege of Terra that he can physically break through almost any defense given sufficient time and commitment. A demon prince Angron, backed by Khorne, fighting his way to the throne room, not to have a duel with a warrior, but to simply destroy the device and the body, represents a genuine existential threat. Similarly, Magnus's approach during the Webway incursion, using the Webway itself as a vector, attacking the throne from an unexpected angle, sapping its energy through sustained psychic pressure, is a more viable strategy against the current Emperor than any direct fight would be. The current Emperor is not easily beaten, but the specific challenges are different from the historical Emperor. The defense is physical and structural rather than personal. The threat is attrition rather than direct assault. Scenario 3. The Emperor freed from the throne and partially regenerated. There is a strand of 40,000 lore that has been developing for some time around the question of what happens if the Emperor dies on the throne. Some sources suggest he would be reborn, that the accumulated faith of 10,000 years of devotion would crystallize in the warp into a new divine consciousness, something powerful enough to finally be free of the physical constraints that have held him. Others suggest something darker, that the Emperor's death on the throne would simply end the Astronomicon, cripple the Imperium, and leave humanity exposed to the full force of chaos without its only real psychic defender. But there is a third possibility, explored in certain lore sources and heavily implied by others, that the Emperor could be healed, that someone or something could repair the Golden Throne, or restore enough of the Emperor's physical form, or provide sufficient additional psychic energy to allow his perpetual healing to finally begin working again. and a partially recovered emperor could emerge from the throne, not at full power, but no longer dying. In this scenario, the question of which Primarch could beat him becomes interesting again, because a partially recovered emperor is neither the invincible peak power version nor the helpless throne-bound version. He is something in between, powerful but not overwhelmingly so, present but perhaps not fully oriented after centuries of near-death stasis. In this window, if such a window opened, the most dangerous candidates are Vulcan and the Lion. Vulcan because his attrition strategy functions well against a target that cannot bring full power to bear immediately. The Lion because his tactical precision and the specific quality of his psychic resistance make him best suited to exploiting the moments when a recovering consciousness might have gaps in its defensive awareness. Scenario 4. All Primarchs together. This is the question that forum threads have debated since before the internet was old enough to have dedicated Warhammer spaces. If all 18 surviving Primarchs attacked the Emperor together, could they win? The most honest answer the lore provides is, probably, eventually. The Emperor is extraordinarily powerful, but he is not infinite. The resources he can bring to bear in any given engagement are enormous but finite, and 18 of the most powerful beings in human history, each approaching the fight from different angles and applying different types of force, would represent a sustained drain that even the Emperor's reserves could not indefinitely sustain. But this scenario requires a level of coordination between Primarchs that the lore suggests would be essentially impossible to achieve. The Primarchs distrust each other almost as much as they distrust anything else. Getting the Loyalists and the traitors to work together toward any goal, including the defeat of the Emperor, would require circumstances so extraordinary that the question becomes almost meaningless. If they could coordinate, and if they could catch the Emperor in a situation where sustained pressure was possible, rather than allowing him to simply eliminate them one by one with concentrated strikes, then yes, 18 Primarchs together probably defeat the Emperor. The closest thing to this scenario that actually happened in the lore was the Siege of Terra, where 8 traitor legions tried to break through to the Emperor. And they nearly did, but the key element was Horus's personal confrontation with the Emperor at the end. Without that, the siege was going to end as soon as Loyalist reinforcements arrived. Section 10. The final verdict. We have examined all the evidence. We have walked through the capabilities, the circumstances, the specific scenarios. Now let us reach the actual answer. But before we do, let us take a moment to appreciate what this question actually reveals about Warhammer 40,000 as a setting, because the answer is not just a power level comparison. It is a statement about the nature of the universe these stories exist in. Warhammer 40,000 is not a setting where the most powerful always win. It is a setting where tragedy is baked into the structure at every level. The Imperium is not a triumph. It is a monument to everything that went wrong. The Emperor's dream of a united secular humanity guided by reason and psychic evolution, that dream is what he sacrificed everything for, and 10,000 years later, it does not exist. What exists is a totalitarian theocracy, sustained by 1,000,000 daily atrocities, worshipping the corpse of the man who despised religious devotion, perpetuating in his name exactly the kind of superstition and cruelty he spent his entire life fighting. The Emperor cannot simply win against any of his sons because the setting does not permit simple victories. Everything costs something. Every triumph is shadowed by what was lost to achieve it. The most honest thing the lore can tell us about whether a Primarch could beat the Emperor is not a power level. It is this. The question matters because it reveals what the Emperor's existence costs, and what alternatives might exist, and whether the tragedy that defines the setting is the only possible outcome, or whether something better could still, against all odds, be built from the ruins. The most honest version of the answer is this. No single Primarch can defeat the Emperor in a direct confrontation if the Emperor is operating at full capacity and fully committed to the fight. This is the conclusion that the lore consistently, repeatedly, and clearly supports. The Emperor is simply too powerful in too many dimensions simultaneously for any one being, however extraordinary, to overcome if he is not holding back. But that is not actually the question most people are asking. The question is not, who could beat the Emperor under ideal circumstances for the Emperor? The question is, who has the most credible path to victories under any achievable circumstances? And that answer has two parts. For historical canon, for the version of this question that has already been answered by the lore itself, the answer is Horus. Under very specific conditions, Chaos God backing, Molech power boost, and an emperor emotionally compromised enough to hesitate, Horus got so close to winning that he effectively did win in the physical sense. The emperor won the war, but Horus won the battle, and the cost was 10,000 years of decay, the death of the greatest project in human history, and the sacrifice of the most beloved of all the Primarchs. For forward-looking canon, for the version of this question that asks which currently living Primarch has the most credible path under circumstances that might actually develop, the answer is more complex. Vulcan is the candidate who cannot be permanently removed from the equation through conventional means, and his attrition strategy is the most theoretically sound approach for a weakened emperor. But he lacks the offensive capability to deliver the killing blow that would be required. The Lion is the candidate whose tactical precision, psychic fortitude, and positioning in the current lore narrative make him the most structurally interesting. He has demonstrated the ability to defeat a demon Primarch. He has complete immunity to Chaos's standard toolkit. He wields artifacts specifically constructed from the Emperor's own power, and the lore is clearly not done building him towards something significant. But the candidate who haunts this question more than any other, the one whose absence from the current lore feels most loaded with potential, most heavy with unrealized narrative weight, is Leman Russ. He has been gone for 10,000 years. He promised to return for the final battle. He is the Emperor's own executioner, the one built specifically for the purpose of doing what must be done when nothing else will. He is immune to chaos in the most fundamental sense, not because chaos cannot reach him, but because his loyalty, refined and hardened across millennia, has become something almost structural rather than personal. If the 40,000 narrative ever arrives at a moment where the Emperor's continued existence on the Golden Throne is genuinely preventing something better, where the kindest, most loyal thing that can be done for humanity is to finally end the Emperor's suffering and allow whatever comes next, then the being built to carry out that mission is Leman Russ. Not through power, not through chaos, through the same absolute terrible faithfulness that made him execute his father's commands without question for 10,000 years, turn toward its final, most devastating application. The Wolf King promised he would return for the Wolf Time. The Wolf Time might be the death of a god, and maybe, just maybe, that was always what it was meant to be. Let us now talk about what defeating the Emperor would actually mean for the galaxy, because this is the question that the power level discussion tends to skip over, and it is perhaps the most important one of all. If a Primarch somehow defeated the Emperor, destroyed his physical body, ended his psychic presence, removed him from the Golden Throne permanently, the consequences would be immediate and catastrophic on a scale that is difficult to fully articulate. The Astronomicon would go dark. Every ship currently traveling through the warp, using the Astronomicon as a navigation beacon, would be lost. Hundreds of millions of ships, carrying billions of soldiers, merchants, pilgrims, and colonists, would be cast adrift in the immaterium without a guide. Many would never find their way back to real space. Many would be consumed by the warp's endless hungers. The psychic barriers that the Emperor maintains against demonic incursion would collapse. The wards around the Imperial Palace, maintained by his presence for 10,000 years, would fail. The Eternity Gate, which he personally holds shut through sheer psychic willpower, would open. Terra itself, the birthplace of humanity, the seat of the Imperium, would be flooded with demonic presence within days. The Imperium, without the Emperor, would not survive in its current form. Many systems would fall to chaos within a generation. Others would be consumed by the Tyranid hive fleets that are already bearing down on the galaxy, for whom the loss of the Astronomicon's psychic light would remove one of the few navigational guides the Imperium has had to predict and counter their movements. The Aeldari, the Tau, the Necrons, every faction in the galaxy would sense the shift in the balance of power and respond accordingly. This is why the question of which Primarch could beat the Emperor is not merely academic. It is not simply a fun theoretical exercise. It is connected, at the deepest level, to the question of what happens next. A Primarch who could defeat the Emperor would also, in the act of doing so, be reshaping the entire galaxy. They would be taking responsibility for the consequences that followed. This is, perhaps, the deepest reason why none of the Primarchs, not even the most powerful, not even the most justified in their grievances, not even the ones who came closest in the lore, actually committed to the act of killing the Emperor with full intent and full awareness of what it would mean. Horus tried to kill him, yes, but Horus was not thinking about what came after. He was consumed by chaos, and chaos does not plan for sustainable futures. It plans for maximum destruction in the present moment. The four Chaos Gods did not want an orderly transition of power. They wanted to shatter the Imperium, flood the Materium with demons, and consume everything. Magnus tried to fight his way to the Emperor during the siege, but his goal was not simply to kill him. His stated purpose in the lore, at least as reported in some sources, was to make the Emperor see what Magnus had become, to force a confrontation that might lead to something other than simple death. Vulcan, despite everything, never moved against the Emperor with lethal intent. His nature is fundamentally protective, not destructive. Even his moments of most extreme violence have been in service of protecting others. The Lion has not yet moved against anyone on the Loyalist side. His current mission in the lore is defined by service and redemption, not by challenging the power structure of the Imperium. Leman Russ, the Executor, the one built for exactly this kind of terrible task, made his prophecy about the wolf time and then left. He has been absent for 10,000 years. His return, when it comes, will define whether the question we have been asking was ever really about power at all. Because the deepest answer to which Primarch could beat the Emperor might be the one who was willing to fully understand the consequences and do it anyway. The one who cared enough about what the Emperor was trying to build, about the humanity of the project, not just the military power of the man, to make the hardest possible choice. That level of understanding and willingness might be rare among the Primarchs. Most of them, even the most powerful, are ultimately fighters. They solve problems with force because that is what they were made to do, what the Emperor built into them because the Great Crusade needed weapons, not philosophers. But two Primarchs stand out as exceptions in this specific dimension. Magnus, who was always fundamentally a thinker, who used power as a tool rather than an identity, and Leman Russ, who was assigned the philosopher's question in the executioner's role. Between these two, the one who understands the warp and its possibilities better than anyone, and the one who was built to act decisively on the worst possible necessity, the answer to our question begins to take a form that is genuinely interesting. Not who could beat the Emperor in a fight, but who could be the instrument through which the Emperor's story reaches its necessary resolution, whatever that resolution turns out to be. And here, finally, is where we land. But before we reach the closing statement, we need to spend some time on the Primarchs we have not fully covered, because this conversation would be incomplete without at least acknowledging them. There are candidates we have deliberately not placed in the primary discussion, because the lore does not support them as strongly, but each one has something interesting to contribute to our overall understanding. Sanguinius of the Blood Angels is the one who haunts every version of this conversation. He is, in terms of the specific fight we are examining, the duel on the Vengeful Spirit, the most relevant Primarch other than Horus. He fought Horus before the Emperor did. He died doing it. But the accounts of that fight, across multiple sources, consistently suggest that Sanguinius came extraordinarily close to winning, that he managed to crack or weaken Horus's armor in a way that may have been essential to the Emperor's eventual success. Some versions of the lore suggest that without Sanguinius's sacrifice, without the wounds he inflicted, without the specific damage he did to Horus's defenses, the Emperor might not have been able to finish the fight. If Sanguinius could do that much to a chaos-empowered Horus, what might he have done against the Emperor directly? The answer the lore gives us is deliberately ambiguous. Sanguinius is described in terms of purity and grace that go beyond simple power. He is, among all the Primarchs, the one most often described as something approaching divine in his own right, the being who embodied the best of humanity's potential rather than its martial capacity. His physical abilities were extraordinary. He was winged, capable of flight, gifted with a precognition that let him perceive threats with uncanny accuracy. But the quality that made him extraordinary was something harder to quantify than raw power. Whether that quality would have been sufficient against the Emperor is unknowable, because Sanguinius never fought him and never would have tried. His loyalty was absolute, and his sacrifice was willingly made. He died so the Emperor could win. That choice, the deliberate sacrifice of self for a greater purpose, might be the most Sanguinius thing imaginable, and it might also represent the most Emperor-like quality any of his sons ever possessed. Rogal Dorn, the Primarch of the Imperial Fists, is never seriously discussed as a candidate for this question, and his absence is itself informative. Dorn was not the most physically powerful Primarch. He was not the most gifted Psyker. He was not a Psyker at all. He was not the most aggressive or the most unpredictable. What he was, more completely than any other Primarch, was reliable. He held the gates of the Imperial Palace through the entire siege of Terra when almost nothing else was working. He fortified defensible positions that should not have been defensible. He held the line time after time against odds that should have overwhelmed him. Dorn is not a candidate for defeating the Emperor, but he is the most credible candidate for a very different role, defending against any attempt by the traitor Primarchs to do so. Of all the loyalist Primarchs, Dorn is the one who has demonstrated most consistently the capacity to hold something precious under sustained assault from overwhelming force. The fact that he is counted among the dead in the current lore adds another layer of tragedy to the setting's long accumulation of losses. Mortarion, the Death Lord of the Death Guard, deserves a word because his abilities as a demon prince of Nurgle are genuinely formidable. He is described as nearly unkillable, even by Primarch standards. His demon form is surrounded by clouds of toxic miasma that sicken even beings who should be immune. His resilience to damage is extraordinary, and his performance in the current era lore includes defeating Guilliman in combat. But Mortarion's path to victory against the Emperor specifically is hard to construct, because his strengths are passive and attritional in a way that the Emperor's specific toolkit is well designed to counter. Nurgle's gifts provide endurance, not offense. They delay defeat more effectively than they produce victory. Perturabo of the Iron Warriors is the Siege Master, the one who eventually broke the walls of the Imperial Palace during the Siege of Terra. His strategic brilliance, combined with his technical mastery and the sheer force of will that drove the Iron Warriors to victories that most legions could not have achieved, makes him an interesting figure. But Perturabo is fundamentally a general rather than a champion. He wins wars through grinding application of superior preparation and firepower, not through the kind of individual combat dominance that the Emperor versus Primarch question implies. In a duel, he is significantly outmatched by most of his brothers, let alone by the Emperor. These candidates, Sanguinius, Dorn, Mortarion, Perturabo, each illuminate different aspects of what makes the Emperor's situation unique. They show us the various dimensions of the problem from different angles, and in doing so, they make the specific candidates we have focused on, Horus, Magnus, Vulcan, Angron, the Lion, Russ, stand out more clearly as the ones who genuinely operate in the space where the question has traction. Here is where we land and where we need to leave it, because the beauty of this question is that the lore never fully resolves it. Warhammer 40,000 is not a story with a predetermined ending. It is a living setting that has been growing and changing for nearly 40 years, and the question of whether the Emperor can be truly challenged, truly threatened, truly overcome by his own sons or anyone else is one of the central tensions that keeps the whole vast machinery of it running. What we can say with confidence is this: the Emperor is the most powerful human being who has ever existed in this setting. His power is real, and it is staggering. No single Primarch defeats him in fair conditions. But the conditions of the 41st millennium are not fair, have never been fair, and are getting less fair with every passing year. The walls of the Imperium are cracking. The Great Rift has torn the galaxy in two. Demon Primarchs walk again in real space with no one able to permanently stop them. The Golden Throne is failing. The 1,000 Psykers sacrificed daily to sustain it are running out. The Custodes have abandoned Terra for the first time in 10,000 years. Roboute Guilliman, the closest thing the Imperium has to a functioning mind in command, is fighting on a dozen fronts simultaneously and barely keeping pace with the rate of catastrophe. The setting is not moving toward stability. It is moving toward a crisis point. the kind of narrative crisis that major fantasy and science fiction settings reach when the accumulated weight of their lore finally demands a reckoning. Something is going to change in the 40,000 setting, in a way that the setting has never truly changed before. The questions that have been unanswered for decades: what happens when the throne finally fails, whether the Emperor can be restored, what Lehman Russ's return will mean, what Lionel Johnson is hunting in the darkest corners of the Imperium Nihilus, are all converging toward answers. And somewhere in the Eye of Terror, a gray-eyed Wolf King is fulfilling a promise he made at a feast long ago, preparing to return for the final battle. What that battle is, who he fights, and what it means for the galaxy, those are questions that the lore has not yet answered. But here is what we know when we bring everything together. The candidate who represents the most plausible path to genuinely defeating the Emperor across all versions of the question is not the most powerful Primarch. It is not the one backed by the most chaos gods. It is not the one with the best weapons or the fastest reflexes or the most elaborate plan. It is the one whose specific nature most precisely addresses the Emperor's specific vulnerabilities. The Emperor's greatest weakness is not power, it is purpose. It is the gap between what he is capable of and what he is willing to do. It is the emotional and strategic hesitation that comes from caring about humanity, from wanting to reach his sons rather than destroy them, from seeing possible futures and choosing carefully which paths he walks. To beat the Emperor, you have to make it impossible for him to hesitate. You have to remove every thread of hope he might cling to. You have to come at him as a necessity rather than an enemy, not as something he wants to fight, but as something that must be resolved. You have to be so clearly, so completely, so irreversibly the instrument of a purpose he himself set in motion that he cannot oppose you without contradicting the deepest logic of his own existence. That description fits Horus with chaos backing better than anyone in the historical canon. It fits the Lion in terms of structural positioning in the current narrative. It fits Lehman Russ in terms of narrative destiny and the shape of the mythology. The setting has been building since its earliest days. None of them have done it yet. Horus came the closest and still fell short. But the setting is moving, the reckoning is coming, and wherever it lands, it will not be anticlimactic. The Emperor created the greatest warriors in human history. He gave them the tools to do things no other beings in the galaxy could do. He sent them out into the darkness to do what was necessary. He just never quite specified what all of that was preparation for. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But somewhere at the end of that war, there might be something that was worth the fighting after all. Whether any Primarch is part of reaching that outcome, whether the journey there requires a challenge to the god on the golden throne, is a question that 40 years of storytelling have been slowly and magnificently building toward, and that is worth watching for. One last thought before we close. Of all the questions that Warhammer 40,000 asks, and it asks many, layered within each other like the nested plots of a Tsimshian scheme, the most fundamental is this: what does it mean to serve something you believe in, when that thing has become corrupted or compromised, or has simply outgrown the form you knew it in? Every Primarch, loyalist, and traitor alike is wrestling with this question in their own way. The loyalists serve a decaying Imperium because they believe in what it was and what it could be. The traitors abandoned it because they decided what it had become was already too broken to save. Neither side has it entirely right. That is the point. The tragedy is not that one side is wrong and the other is right. The tragedy is that both sides contain real truth, and the genuine answer requires holding both truths simultaneously, which is exactly the kind of thing that beings built for war, for decisive action, for clear objectives and measurable victories are poorly equipped to do. The Emperor built weapons. He needed philosophers. He built generals. He needed diplomats. He built killers. He needed healers. The Primarchs are all magnificent at what they were designed to do. The gap between what they were designed to do and what the situation actually requires is the space where everything went wrong. Whether that gap can ever be closed, whether some combination of Primarchs, circumstances, and the Emperor's own accumulated wisdom can finally produce the outcome he spent 48,000 years working toward, is the question that the next decade of Warhammer 40,000 lore will begin to answer. The Emperor protects. That is the mantra. That is the prayer. That is the desperate hope of 1 trillion human beings looking toward Terra and its dying light. But maybe, just maybe, the time for the Emperor to protect is ending. Maybe the time for the Emperor to be freed from the burden of protection is coming at last. Maybe the thing that needs to happen is not for someone to defeat him, but for someone to finally, after all this time, do for him what he spent all those centuries doing for everyone else. Maybe the question is not which Primarch can beat the Emperor. Maybe the question is which Primarch loved him enough to let him rest. If this video gave you something to think about, I would genuinely love to know what you think in the comments. Which Primarch do you believe has the best shot? Is it one of the candidates we discussed? Or is there a dark horse you think we missed? Is there a scenario we did not consider that would completely flip the answer? Drop it below. I read every single comment, and the conversations in the comment section on these deep lore videos are some of the best Warhammer discussion happening anywhere on the internet. And if you want to be here when the next deep lore exploration drops, make sure you are subscribed. New videos go up regularly, and every single one is built around the kind of detailed, researched, atmospheric lore that this community deserves. Hit the notification bell so you never miss one. Thank you for watching. The Emperor protects, mostly. Until next time.